George Colburn is the creator of the Eisenhower Legacy Project. Thanks for joining us here on American History TV.
Happy to be here.
What can you tell us about the Eisenhower Interview Archive?
We started doing on-camera interviews in 1990, which was the Eisenhower Centennial, and there were conferences in Abilene, his hometown, Gettysburg, his adopted home, and of all places, Moscow, which was still behind the Iron Curtain. And we raised enough money at that time where I could go interview people who helped create history in the Eisenhower era. So it all began in 1990.
How many people in all have you interviewed?
We have about 140 on-camera, broadcast quality tapes, interviews with witnesses to history. Those who knew Eisenhower, reported on Eisenhower, hated Eisenhower, those who were with him in war, against him in the Cold War. And then since 2002, I've started interviewing scholars and writers who have mined the Eisenhower papers for books that defined the Eisenhower presidency.
What's the purpose of interviewing all of those associated with Ike?
I'm a print journalist at heart, and I every time I found some money for the project, I'd say I really have to interview Bob Donovan of the Washington Post, or Scotty Reston of the New York Times, or that Department of Labor guy, or so on. The purpose was to round out the story so that, let's say I'm doing a story on the domestic politics and policies of the Eisenhower presidency, and I wanted all the common questions to be answered, not by my script, but by an expert who was there, who reported on it, or whatever. When I wanted to talk about the relationship of Eisenhower with a Democratic Congress, the leadership of the Congress, Sam Rayburn, in the House, Lyndon Johnson, I went to John Connally, who was a buddy of both of them, and I was able to find out about that relationship.
Did you find that most of the subjects and the Eisenhower family were cooperative in your request for interviews?
Let me give credit where credit was due. This was a project that I started out on reluctantly, and but I owed someone a big favor. His name was Abbott Washburn. He was an FCC commissioner at that time, but he had been the deputy director of the USIA in the Eisenhower years.
Information Agency?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, absolutely right. And in the first several years of getting interviews, Abbott was my front man. Everybody knew Abbott. Abbott had the largest Rolodex I'd ever seen in my life. It was like this. And if I wanted, who's the guy behind the ICBM? Oh, that's General Shriver. Well, I'd like to talk to him. Well, let me find him. And he'd find him for me.
And then you talked also about getting enough money to do this. Briefly, how did you do that? How did money become available to do these productions?
Again, Abbott Washburn was critical in the beginning. I did 3 primetime shows, 91, 93, 95, on Discovery and Disney. And the money was small amounts here and there. Abbott knew where there was money for Eisenhower. He said, well, I'll write Walter Annenberg of the Annenberg Foundation. I mean, it was that kind of thing. It was very, very difficult to raise money for Eisenhower because in 1990, when we started the project, the mythology of Eisenhower was he was a do-nothing president. He didn't fight for civil rights. He didn't fight against McCarthy. Basically played golf and played with his grandkids. Obviously, history has the historians and the scholars and the researchers that prove that, it's all wrong. But at that time, people say, oh, he's not sexy enough, you know. If he were commander of the armies, maybe, but I had real difficult time raising money. Couldn't have done it without Abbott Washburn. And later, another Eisenhower person, his name was George Wills.
Looking at the whole of the interview archive, is it weighted more towards his war years or his presidency?
It's weighted toward the presidency. There was no question about his reputation in the war years. The Eisenhower people who came to me and asked me if I would consider doing this program came to me. They knew me through a friend, but also they knew I was a historian, and my interest was politics.
I understand you also interviewed a number of former presidents. Who was the most interesting? Who did you interview, and who was the most interesting?
Oh, that's a good question. I interviewed Presidents Ford, George Herbert Walker Bush, President Reagan, and President Nixon. Now, to me, obviously, Ike's vice president, Richard Nixon, was the one I was most interested in. And I'd say a couple of things. It was a tremendously successful interview. It was limited only to foreign affairs, and that was fine with me. Nixon is well known for his foreign affairs expertise. But when we went to interview him, his secretary said he's prepped for 3 days for this visit. That was one thing. And the second, the second thing is that his answers weren't rehearsed particularly, but they were clean and full. And when I got through there, I was a very happy writer-producer.
In the course of doing all these interviews, how has your impression of Ike as a president changed, or has it?
It's a very dramatic change. I did not want to do this project. I was moving from my base in New York to LA. I had new business out in LA. I had been schooled in the 60s, graduate school, strictly in history, with people who were all Kennedy fans. And in fact, my first month in graduate school, Kennedy was killed. And so that was the aura of my whole graduate education. And as far as I knew, he was a military hero, World War II, and a real mistake as president. And I did not want to do this project. And when Abbott Washburn and others invited me to Washington to discuss it, they were very persuasive about what I would find out if I do my homework. So I agreed to do the R&D, and I found out, indeed, the revisionism had started, but only in academic books. And it was very easy to find out there was a fun story here. And as a journalist, I was very interested in that.
Do you think that has contributed to a change in view in terms of the scholarship on Ike? Do you think your work has contributed to a different appraisal of his presidency?
My work personally, I can't say, but I know that my programs have reached into millions of homes. We did a 20-part educational series that Disney Education put out that reached lots of classrooms. It is now going to be streamed coming up, those 20 educational programs, new technology, new people to reach. So it might have had an influence, but I was riding the tide of revisionism. In this past year alone, there are four trade books about Eisenhower that have come out, all revisionist.
What do you hope that viewers take away from the interviews? If there's one or two things that you'd like them to take away, what would they be?
Well, first of all, don't believe the mythology about the Eisenhower presidency. It's very strong. I mean, to try and break through it, you know, I've had very important people say, well, you know, he didn't really do anything, did he? And, you know, his list of achievements are major. What he did in foreign affairs to keep the lid on the Cold War was absolutely amazing. The new show that I have coming out is a two-part series called Eisenhower's Secret War. and it's basically what Eisenhower titled his memoir was called Waging Peace. He waged peace very effectively, lost one soldier in 8 years, ended a major war. He wouldn't go to war. And I think that the mythology of Eisenhower and the presidency is seen. If you looked at the major textbooks that our children are reading up until very recently, they have all reflected the mythology. For me as a historian and as a journalist, it's very disappointing.
Is that starting to change in textbooks?
Actually, I was asked only recently, because we're going to re-release the education series, that what the textbooks are like now. Now, I haven't been giving talks to teachers lately, so I can't answer that question. They were terrible up to 10 years ago.
As we begin to wrap up here, you've been doing these interviews for 20 plus years on Eisenhower. The technology for making films, for doing interviews, has changed a whole lot. Has that made your work any easier?
Absolutely, much easier. I started out actually doing the first interviews, with 11-minute film canisters, and if you were an interviewee, you're on a roll. Wait a minute, I got to change the canister. Now we're doing it tapeless, so I can also edit, in my closet now if I want to. So all of the tapes, how many? We have more, including our archive footage. We have 700-800, master tapes, but we can put them on a couple of small digital towers now. Made my life much easier.
Lastly, who's on your list of the top couple are still on your list of still to be interviewed?
Most of the Eisenhower witnesses are gone. I think that, I may be wrong, but in this last batch, this last go-round where I've interviewed mainly scholars, I have found other people who are terribly important. The story of his election in '52 is a great story, never been told properly. And I discovered in 2002 the co-founder of Citizens for Eisenhower was alive and well and living in Palm Beach, Florida, Stanley Rumbaugh. I built a program around the story of Citizens for Eisenhower. Eisenhower would not have run without that group's backing.
George Colburn, producer and creator of the Eisenhower Legacy Project and the Eisenhower Interview Archive. Thanks for joining us here on American History TV.
I'm delighted to have been here. Thanks for talking with me.